Welcome to Glory Days, the brand new podcast where we look back at moments that set the sporting world on fire. I'm Nick Brookes, and today we're going to be talking Premier League football. So, unless you've been living under a rock, you'll know that it's tight at the top and that nothing looks like splitting England's three best teams. This title race could end up better than all that came before it, and there have been some crackers. In my mind, none as dramatic as the battle between United and Newcastle in 95-96. So let's travel back in time and talk about a title race for the ages. 28 years ago, football was a very different beast, a sport still transitioning from the mud and guts of the old First Division to the modern money spinner the Premier League would become. 95-96 was the first year UEFA had lifted its 3 foreign player rule, so squads were still chock full of homegrown talent with just a sprinkling of foreign stardust. At the heart of this feast were two very different men. At 44, there was still something of the boy wonder about Kevin Keegan. A local lad and a 2-time Ballon d'Or winner, he'd become a legend when he joined Newcastle as a player. As a coach, he'd roused a sleeping giant. In 1992, they'd been a game away from falling into the 3rd Division and possibly going out of business. When they were promoted back to the top flight a year later, Keegan publicly wrote, "Watch out, Alex, we'll be after your title." He was positive, almost to the point of toxicity, and believed there was nothing his team couldn't do. Alex Ferguson, meanwhile, was a headmasterly figure, a quiet tyrant who struck fear into the hearts of players, pundits and managers alike. Having led United to titles in 93 and 94, Fergie was already Mr. Premiership. Yet he started the season under pressure. Man U had thrown away the title with a final day draw at West Ham and let the FA Cup slip through their fingers too. More worryingly, Fergie'd allowed 3 big stars, Ince, Hughes and Kanchelskis, to leave in the summer and hadn't brought anyone in to replace them.
3 players have departed. The trick is always buy when you're strong. So he needs to buy players. You can't win anything with kids. You look at that line at Manchester United today, and Aston Villa at 2:15 when they get the team sheet, it's just going to give them a lift, and it'll happen every time he plays the kids. He's got to buy players, as simple as that.
At the time, it seemed fair criticism. With Giggs and Cole injured, Bruce suspended and Cantona still banned, United fielded a callow side and were handily beaten by Villa. 3-0 down after 35 minutes, it was getting ugly. No doubt a number of fans enjoying their half-time pint agreed with Hansen. Even some of United's players felt he might have a point. Yet it just so happened that these kids, all 20 or under, were Neville and Neville, Butt, Scholes and Beckham. And they produced flashes of electric football in the second half. Villa's keeper had to make some quality stops. In the game's final throws, the unknown David Beckham scored with a 40-yard outside of the boot screamer. Shouldn't that have got United's fans going? Despite the result, weren't there enough glimmers of hope to suggest these kids were all right? As their season gathered steam, "You can't win anything with kids" became a mantra around Old Trafford, voiced as often and easily as the chorus of a catchy pop song. They even got T-shirts printed. Hansen's words had poured fuel on a flickering fire. Even before the season began, Newcastle had been on a quest to capture hearts and minds. They were a people's club who played with swagger and style and had a common touch United simply couldn't match. Since they'd started training at Durham University, thousands of fans would turn out for sessions. Keegan had lunch with them at a burger van across the road. When David Ginola first arrived, he mistook a student running laps for one of his teammates. "Were there any good restaurants in town?" Ginola asked. In a flash, the pair had arranged for dinner out in Newcastle. Looking like Adonis had been cast in a Jean-Paul Gaultier ad, Ginola brought continental glamour to Tyneside. On away days, he'd sit at the back of the bus smoking Gauloise. On the pitch, he danced past players like they didn't exist. He and Keith Gillespie wreaked havoc on the wings, bombing crosses into the box towards a striker who'd get his head on anything. Newcastle fans had been up in arms when the club sold Andy Cole to United in 1995, but in Les Ferdinand they found the perfect replacement. Les had blistering pace and plenty of class to go along with his aerial ability. He opened his account by rounding Coventry's keeper. After a hat-trick against Wimbledon, he had 13 in 10. Newcastle had won 9 of those, often blowing teams away in the process. Through this early season stretch, Keegan's side were the definition of box office. Quickly and deservedly, they earned the tag the entertainers. They moved the ball with pace, scored goals for fun, and played in one of the most beautiful kits the game has ever seen. By the 21st of October, they were 4 points clear. Not one for painstaking tactics. Keegan simply told his team to go out and play. He seemed convinced that they were invincible. At one point, he took to the changing room whiteboard to draw a picture of a snowball rolling down a hill, gaining size and momentum week after week. That was Newcastle United in the autumn of 1995. But Man U weren't as bad as that first half at Villa suggested. Giggs and Cole came back, bringing steel and silk to a side that rattled off 5 wins on the bounce. And on the 1st of October came the moment Manchester had been waiting for. After 9 months on the sideline, United were ready for the return of the King. Amidst a pile-on from the English media, Cantona had wanted to leave in the summer. No doubt he was glad Fergie talked him down, for this was a day to remember. It felt written in the stars that he'd return against Liverpool. Fans wore berets and waved tricolour flags as coronation music piped around Old Trafford. There was a guttural roar as Cantona, collar up, emerged from the tunnel. In the second minute, he found space on the left flank and teed up Nicky Butt with a lovely floating cross. An hour later, United were 2-1 down, but when Giggs was brought down in the box, Cantona stepped up. With a pillow-soft side-footed finish, he placed the ball in the bottom corner. The King was back. United could only manage a point, but Cantona had announced his return in style. His footprints would be all over the title race. Still, at the halfway stage, it seemed there might not be a race at all. Newcastle scored 40 goals in their first 19 games. At Christmas, they were 10 points clear, having won 10 out of 10 at home. Yet those aimless days before New Year brought an uncharacteristic stumble, as Keegan's side travelled to Old Trafford and were handily beaten 2-0. At the time, it felt an insignificant blip. After all, Newcastle followed up with 5 wins on the bounce, signed Tino Asprilla, and spent much of January 12 points ahead of the pack. If the Magpies were the entertainers, Asprilla seemed straight out of Hollywood. He touched town in Tyneside in a thick fur coat. The press, who dubbed him a cross between Gazza and George Best, were instantly entranced. They revelled in stories of porn star girlfriends, in the fact Tino was serving a suspended sentence for firing his gun while celebrating New Year's Day. He'd have to report to the Colombian embassy each Thursday and miss training, but that was all part of the Asprilla package. As soon as he touched down, Keegan met Tino for a glass of red and put forth a novel idea. Why didn't he sit on the bench for the game against Middlesbrough, get a feel for things up close? The plan wasn't for him to get on the pitch, but 73 minutes in, Newcastle were 1-0 down and needed a spark. Keegan turned to Asprilla. Within minutes, he'd produce a devilish bit of skill and a pinpoint cross to level the match. Soon after, Ferdinand found the winner. At this stage, it still felt like nothing could stop the snowball from rolling. But out of nowhere, the entertainers fell flat. On the 21st of February, they went to West Ham and got beat. 3 days later, they needed a late equaliser to cling on for a draw at struggling City. It was a bad time for a lapse, but Newcastle remained in control of their destiny. On the 4th of March, they welcomed United to St James's Park, knowing that victory would restore their 7-point lead. This heavyweight clash produced a performance for the ages. For most of the match, Newcastle were all over their rivals. Asprilla gave Gary Neville a torrid time. Through the first half, he and Ferdinand ran riot. Yet Schmeichel was equal to all they threw at him, springing from his line like a cat, stretching and sprawling in every direction. United hardly had a kick of the ball, but in the 51st minute, Cantona, lurking unguarded at the back post, volleyed home. Who else? The gap was down to 4. And Newcastle's brutal run continued. On the 23rd of March, they were beaten at Arsenal. Next up was a trip to Anfield, frequently dubbed the best Premier League clash of all time. 1-0 down in a matter of seconds, Newcastle led twice and looked destined to take the points until a late Collymore double turned the table. Liverpool 4, Newcastle 3. Only the coldest of hearts could not feel sympathy, seeing Keegan slumped in his seat, head in his hands. Newcastle fans were left tearing their hair out. Between the 21st of February and the 8th of April, their team claimed 4 of a possible 18 points. It was hard to explain. Injuries, inexperience and late-season malaise all played their part. But wasn't there a whiff of bad luck too? However you sliced it, having led the league all through winter, Newcastle went into spring, staring up at Man United. And Schmeichel wasn't the only one turning it on at Old Trafford. As Newcastle stuttered and slumped, United were showing the sort of steel reserved for champions. After losing on New Year's Day, they went on a 12-match unbeaten run, drawing just twice. One man stood tall above the rest. If, like me, you're too young to remember Cantona and his pomp, you might wonder what all the hype was about. Sure, he was a mercurial artist, a footballing philosopher whose popped collar was a defining symbol of 90s cool. But was he really that influential? The short answer is yes. With United's season in the balance week after week, he proved himself a big game player. After scoring the only goal in the Newcastle clash, he struck in injury time to rescue a point at QPR. scored decisive goals against Arsenal and Spurs, slotted home a penalty in a 3-2 win against City, and then scored again as United beat Coventry 1-0. When others' nerves were fraught, Eric was electric. In his first 9 games back, he struck just twice, both penalties. Yet during this 6-game stretch, he scored 6 of the club's 8, as United closed out game after game by a single-goal margin. Cantona had emphatically proven his worth, and Fergie deserves huge credit too. After his Bruce Lee impression a year earlier, most managers would have washed their hands of the Frenchman, but Ferguson saw he was a special player and gave him more rope than the rest of the squad. None of the others resented it. They understood how vital Eric was. As he'd reflected, or prophesied after that night at Selhurst Park, he was a hulking, unstoppable trawler. The rest of us were just seagulls, following in his wake. Newcastle's dramas weren't over. When QPR came to town on the 6th of April, the Magpies trailed for most of the second half, but a late Beardsley double assured them of all 3 points and kept them in the hunt. Strange scheduling meant they'd have to head to champions Blackburn 2 days later. It was another tough night to be a Geordie. When Graham Fenton struck a late leveller, Newcastle went chasing a winner. Instead, they got caught on the break and headed back to Tyneside with nothing. Still, a rare United blip meant the title race was alive. And at this point, with the season into its dying embers, things well and truly caught fire. Newcastle managed back-to-back wins for the first time since February. After United narrowly beat Leeds, Fergie felt it was time to ruffle Keegan's feathers.
Top 6. I just don't understand it. They're good players, aren't they? And if they produced effort like that, they would be top 6. But of course, you think for some of them it's more important to get a result against Manchester United to stop and win the league than anything else, which to me is they're cheating their manager. That's all it is.
It was a bold outburst, yet it's hard to escape the sense that it was perfectly stage-managed, designed to cause maximum harm to United's biggest rivals. Of course, Newcastle's next game was against Leeds. After that, they'd head to Forest, who Fergie claimed might also take it easy on the Magpies, since the 2 teams had arranged to play a testimonial for Stuart Pearce at season's end. It was a silver-tongued Machiavellian piece of brilliance. In one fell swoop, Ferguson made sure that both Forest and Leeds would throw the kitchen sink at Newcastle. Plus, he seriously wound up his biggest rival. After Newcastle won at Ellen Road, Keegan launched a tirade against Ferguson.
When you do that with footballers, like he said about Leeds, and when you do things like that about a man like Stuart Pearce, I've kept really quiet, but I'll tell you something. He went down in my estimation when he said that. We have not resorted to that, but I'll tell you, you can tell him now, be watching it, we're still fighting for this title, and he's got to go to Middlesbrough and get something. And I'll tell you, honestly, I will love it if we beat them. Love it.
It was quite the rant. Managers often lose their rag on the touchline, but it's rare to see one look so furious in an interview. Here, the enduringly positive Keegan was left bewildered, on the brink of tears. Ginola said the team heard him shouting and ran out of the changing room, thinking their manager was getting into a scrap. There can be no doubt the interview showed a man cracking under the strain of the title race, a manager drowning under pressure. Keegan's tried to downplay the impact of his words, claiming the title race was virtually over by that point. But that's not entirely true. Newcastle were 3 points behind Fergie's men with the game in hand. Had they won their last 2, they would have finished level on points with United. Instead, they only managed draws against Forest and Tottenham, while United blew past Middlesbrough on the final day. Those last games feel symbolic. Newcastle, already anointed at Christmas, had badly broken down during the second half of the season. Bar David Batty, who joined the club in March, none of the players had been close to a Premier League title before. Yes, there were external factors too, but they seemed to succumb when the pressure ramped up. United, meanwhile, second best for so much of the campaign, saved themselves for the run-in. When it really mattered, they showed the sort of never-say-die attitude that would prove a hallmark of Ferguson's sides. It's funny to think how the outcome might have changed football. A week after sealing the title, United headed to Wembley for the FA Cup final. Apparently they knew they won it when they saw Liverpool's dodgy white suits. Late in the day, a Cantona volley sealed victory. Fergie's men had done the double, a springboard towards them becoming the greatest dynasty English football has seen. Between 96 and 2003, they won 6 of 8 Premier Leagues. The kids who Hansen dismissed became the backbone of the club. Beckham, Butt, Neville, Keane, Scholes, Giggs. For the next decade, these names were synonymous with winning. But had the league slipped through their fingers for the second time in 2 years? Who knows what might have been? Would they have had the mettle to win the cup at Wembley? Could the axe have fallen on Ferguson? It's entirely possible to imagine a scenario where one of football's greatest teams never took flight. And had Newcastle been crowned champions? Could they have gone on to greatness instead? As it was, Keegan was gone by the next January. The club hasn't come close to a Premier League title since. Still, anyone who remembers football in 95-96 will tell you Newcastle lit up the league. Their players dominated the PFA team of the season. Ferdinand, Ginola and Rob Lee all made the cut. From United, there was just Gary Neville. That looks wild in hindsight. No Cantona, no Schmeichel, no Keane. Equally, from United, only the Neville brothers were picked for England's Euro squad. Bruce, Pallister, Butt, Scholes, Cole and Beckham were all passed over. It seems like the vibrant, emotive force of Newcastle's football led United's players to be widely underrated. Sure, they eked out plenty of 1-0s, but from Boxing Day on, Fergie's men claimed 47 of 57 points. When the going got tough, they emphatically got going. There's so much to love about this season, so much to unpack we've barely scratched the surface. But was it the best title race of them all? Was City's triumph in 2012 more dramatic? Will 2024 be even better? Drop me a line and tell me your thoughts.